oh, but this food tastes so good. And, I'm telling myself I probably shouldn't, but I really am tempted by it. So I really want this food. It's more about the food. Whereas binging feels like it's more about something else. It feels like this bigger monster that you're dealing with.
Hello, welcome back to the Uncovery podcast. My name's Maddie Quinlan, and today we have such a great conversation, and I think a really timely one as we sort of step into the new year of 2022 and all of the diet culture narratives and we shouldn't be eating so much kind of messaging that is not just, I think, detrimental to people that have eating disorders, but pretty much I think it's damaging to everyone, and we could all really, be a little bit more gracious with ourselves and just navigate our worlds as though we are perfectly fine as our bodies move and change and go into different seasons, and just not constantly be harping on beating ourselves up as we step into the new year, because there's enough pressure that happens in our lives anyway. Today, I am talking to Sarah Dosanjh, and she's a binge eating disorder therapist, and it was just so great to get to talk to her. I had a few friends, actually, when I started this podcast, reach out to me and say, I feel like I binge eat. I don't know when it's just overeating or if it actually is a problem. And I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with and that they're very, very quiet about, even in compared to other eating disorders. As we learn in this conversation, it is actually the most common eating disorder is binge eating disorder. And I have very little expertise. I have much less information about this. So it was really great to have an expert on. And so Sarah Dosanjh is a psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating. As someone in recovery from binge eating, she draws on her personal and professional experience to create content designed to help others struggling with food and body image. You can find Sarah on Instagram, YouTube, and as the co-host of the Life After Diets podcast. So all of her information will be linked in the show notes, of course, as usual. And her book is called I Can't Stop Eating. And so we talk about that and the method that she kind of uses in people recovering from binge eating disorder. So without further ado, I bring you Sarah Dosanjh. So Sarah Dosanjh, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Maddie. Thank you for having me.
It was serendipitous almost when I kind of stumbled upon some of your work as I was starting this podcast and talking about it to friends. And I was immediately receiving feedback from certain friends about binge eating and saying, hey, this is something that I deal with, or have you ever thought about having a guest on to talk about this? And it was very close to the top of my list anyway. But as that was happening, I was stumbling into your work. And so I felt like the universe was aligning and that I just needed to have you on because this hasn't been an area that I've been as familiar with. And so I couldn't say enough to be grateful to have you here. So I want to just kind of start off, and maybe you could tell me a little bit about what brought you into this work, your kind of background of eating disorders and specifically binge eating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just want to say, first of all, in the eating disorder world, I feel like the binge eaters get a really rough ride. There's so much misunderstandings, I think, around binge eating, and even as much as how common it is, because here in the UK, our statistics are something like, I think 22% of eating disorders are binge eating disorder.
Wow.
And just to compare that to the anorexia and bulimia figures, anorexia is 8% and bulimia is 19%. And yet it's the one that gets taken less seriously, and people go to the doctors and the doctors don't recognize it. So I got into it because of my own struggle with binge eating. I grew up with a pretty good relationship with food. I was pretty intuitive. I was pretty free. In my mid-20s, I decided to try and lose a very small amount of weight, was all I wanted to lose at the time. And it wasn't because I felt that I was too big. I just noticed over a couple of years, I put on a few pounds, and I thought, I just want to keep an eye on it because I want to stay in this place that I'd always maintained really easily and effortlessly before. And so I did one of these hypnosis things. I won't name them, but they're quite a famous hypnosis here in the UK. I think they do international work as well. And this person had a book and a CD. Remember CDs?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Audio tracks on CD. You got a Discman.
Yeah, exactly. So I read this book, and it was just all about eating super slowly and stopping basically the moment you're not hungry anymore. So it was the hunger fullness diet. And although of course it wasn't called a diet, and I did it for a few weeks, and I lost a bit of weight, and I thought this was so easy. Why do people talk about how difficult it is to lose weight? I mean, when I look back now, I think sometimes I think like life has just got a sense of humor and just wanted to knock me down a peg or two.
Yeah. Oh, you thought you were so clever. Yes.
I know. I got the answers. So after a few weeks, when I stopped doing this, I just started binging. I'd never binge ate before. And it was extreme, especially when compared to how short a period of time I'd actually restricted for. And I hadn't felt deprived, and I'd only lost a very small amount of weight. And it was like I was hungry 24/7. I was getting up in the middle of the night to eat. I can remember at the time saying to some people close to me, saying, it's like when I eat, I feel like I haven't eaten. Like in my thinking mind, I know that I've eaten, but I feel like I haven't eaten. That's the only way I could describe it. And so I binged for 9 months of just binging pretty much every day. I was doing as much exercise as I could bring myself to do, but not enough to stop my weight from gaining. So I gained, again, I don't really like to talk numbers. I think it'd be quite problematic.
Sure. Yeah.
But I went up several clothes sizes in the matter of 9 months. So I felt almost overnight that I didn't recognize who I saw in the mirror. And because my body changed so fast, I went through that experience that at the time felt very shameful, of seeing somebody that you saw only about 3 or 4 months ago, and they do a double take because of how different that you look. They don't say anything because they were just really nice people I had around me at that time.
Right,
but I could feel
course.
it. I could feel it, and I knew that people, particularly at work, were talking about it. And then after about 9 months, because I was so frightened, and I honestly thought that I was going to binge myself into a place of physical incapacitation, I then started engaging in purging and bulimic behaviors. So that was the point for me when it went from binge eating disorder into bulimia. And I did try to go to the doctor when I was binge eating before. And I remember the doctor saying, if it goes on longer, kind of come back. It was a very dismissive thing. And then the moment that I started purging, literally after, I think the first time I'd actually purged, I went to the GP and I said, I think I have bulimia. I felt like now I had a name for it. I knew what the problem was, so I could fix it. And the doctor diagnosed me with bulimia straight away.
Oh, imagine after all of this time and trying to get help with something and saying, look, I feel out of control. This is what's happening to me. And have them be like, well, we don't really have a name for that, or we don't really qualify that. So wait until something really severe happens, and then we can put a nice little label on you and help you. Oof.
Basically. And the kicker was I wouldn't have fit the criteria, because back then that was the DSM-4, and that has to go on for 6 months for you to meet the criteria. But they didn't even care about that. They're like, oh, we hear about purging, we hear, okay, bulimia. So then I got sent to the eating disorder clinic, and I was waiting for treatment there, and I was reading all the books, and I went to see a private CBT therapist while I was binge eating before it was bulimia, and I did everything she told me to do. I ate all the regular meals. I kept the food, faithfully did everything she told me to do, and nothing was changing. And after, I think, week 7 or 8, I was leaving the office, and she said to me, Sarah, I really want you to try this week. And it was crushing at the time. And I believed it. And I think for years I carried this belief that the reason why I couldn't get a handle on this was I just can't be trying hard enough. And I look back at me then, I have so much compassion for her back then, because she was trying so hard. But at that time, around about the time, maybe sort of 5-6 months after the bulimia started, somebody suggested I tried coming off the contraceptive pill because that could mess about with your appetite.
Oh, interesting.
So I stopped taking the contraceptive pill and my menstrual cycle didn't restart. So after a few months of no cycle, I go to the GP, they do a blood test, and it comes back with there's an abnormal hormonal issue. So that gets investigated. And then eventually they do a brain scan and they find out I've got a tumor between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So it's at the bottom of the midbrain. So the tumor's pressing up into the hypothalamus and it's affecting the pituitary gland. So it's whacking all my hormones out. Plus the hypothalamus, we know, affects appetite. So like everything about my biology
is just completely out of whack. And then was it this question of, did something get triggered because of that sort of period of restriction that then kind of slingshotted you into binging, but then it was also exacerbated by the fact that you had a tumor, and like what kind of came first?
I would love to be able to get a proper answer. This is why it's sometimes quite difficult for me to tell my story in this way, because also a lot of people won't relate to this part of it. So when they started replacing the hormones, I was in this sort of trying to restrict cycle, and there was all the other pathology, all the other thoughts and beliefs and feelings and behaviors around eating disorder. So I went to OA meetings and I listened to other people talking about it, and I related to everything. And it was really hard for me to know, like, where does this biology end and the psychology of it begin? I just think it really affected me, and I couldn't go back to how I was with food. It just wasn't possible after having gone through that amount of distress and turmoil and all the shame and everything that had been associated with that. So it didn't fix my eating problems when they started replacing the hormones. It changed. Something did shift. I felt a bit better in myself because I think my energy levels had been so low as well, and that had been making me want to eat more too. So I probably carried on struggling with bulimia for another few years after that. And the bulimia, it got to a point where it was just too painful to keep it up. And I always felt like I fit more into the binge eating disorder category than bulimia, because yes, sometimes I would purge, but sometimes I wouldn't purge. And I made a decision because I'd realized that whenever I went through a cycle of purging, I could never go from purging into balance. I always went from, I stopped purging, I would binge for a bit, and then I would find a bit of balance for a bit. So I made this decision one day. I thought, I cannot purge anymore. Like, regardless of the consequences, I'll take the weight gain, because it was so psychologically and emotionally damaging to me. So I made the decision. So now I was just back in binging.
Right. You're like, okay, well, now we've shape shifted, and that this is just how it kind of goes, is that it kind of shape shifts from this one type of quote unquote disorder into a different manifestation of it.
Exactly. And around this time, I decided to train to be a therapist. I decided to have a career change. I just felt like it was time for something different. I didn't know when I was training to be a therapist that I would end up working with disordered eating, because I knew I was too in it. I did think maybe one day, if I, in my mind, the way I thought, it just got my act together, because I was still thinking that I should be able to just
turn it off, just
want it enough.
Well, try more.
And I think, isn't that the trap though? Because I think people think, well, if I wanted it enough, I should be able to stop this behavior. It doesn't make sense. It's so compelling. So that, of course, put me into weekly therapy, because you have to be in weekly therapy while you're training to be a therapist. At least here in the UK, you do. So it gave me 5 years of mandated one-to-one therapy.
Amazing. What an amazing consequence of forced therapy. You're like, oh, maybe this will actually help me with something.
But interestingly, it helped with so many things, because it helped with the thing that I really related to that comes up with the binge eating all the time, is the all or nothing black and white thinking. That is, I've not yet met somebody who's an exception to that. And people are pretty good at recognizing it in themselves as well when you ask them about it. So it really helped me to work on that part of me. But because none of the therapists I worked with were eating disorder therapists, and this is where therapists fall down a bit, I think, with the binge eating disorder, is they kind of collude with the weight loss part.
Yeah.
Because, I was not in a slim body and I wanted to lose weight. They were like, yeah, we need to get you well so you can lose weight as if losing weight was part of being well. So one of my therapists, God bless her, because she was a lovely woman who helped me in a lot of ways, but she suggested doing the 5-2 diet, which
No, you did not have a therapist recommending a diet to you as you're struggling with an eating disorder. Oh, and you know what? I bet, and I think that actually is unfortunately not a unique experience, especially when it comes to like either the bulimic, but specifically with binge eating disorder, is that unless a therapist has an incredibly deep understanding of what's really going on, and they have this prejudgment about what a person in a larger body must need, and they treat these people as such, and it's like that person is already probably beating themselves up about their weight. You're there to help them. And so I think that that's really probably a common experience. Yeah.
And therapists who have congratulated me on weight loss and told me how good I look, complimented weight loss, all of these things. So this is the kicker. I wouldn't say that I managed to actually recover from binge eating until I stopped therapy. Wow. Because this was the missing piece for me. And it was around the restriction side of things, because I meet a lot of people who struggle with binge eating who are really good at dieting. When they get in that diet zone, they can control, they could do that. I never was. I would go through very, very short spurts of managing to stick to some kind of diet. I did not have those periods of time where I stuck to anything for a long time. So when I was hearing all this talk out there about binge eating being triggered by restriction, I was like, but that's not me. I'm not under eating. So I kind of ignored that part. And actually, it wasn't until I came to the realization that restrictive thinking, that message wasn't out there, but how much restrictive thinking can impact that. Every night I would go to bed with my eyes closed saying, tomorrow I'm going to do better. Tomorrow, the minute that I didn't, okay, now it's last supper eating. I've blown it. It's the black and white thinking. I eat everything today so I can start with a clean slate again tomorrow. This was the bit that was the last piece of the puzzle, I think, for me, that really helped when I did that. And that was, even knowing that isn't always enough to be able to do it straight away, because this kind of restrictive, like diet mentality thinking is really sneaky and really pervasive, and it creeps in all kinds of ways. And there'd be times when I didn't feel comfortable and I did want to lose weight. And it wasn't until, I think the other thing that I thought would happen, I thought, well, if I stop binge eating, because I do so much binge eating, like the weight's just going to fall off me.
Right. Surely.
That was the hope, because it just didn't make any sense to me any other way. So the minute I would have sort of a reprieve from the binge eating and my weight wasn't dropping dramatically, or it would come down a bit and then it would plateau a bit, I would get wrapped up in that again. And I think, oh, I can do a bit better. So I kept tripping up and falling back into this restrictive thinking cycle, but it got longer and further apart. And now when people will say to me, like, I want to give up this dieting thing, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to accept not pursuing weight loss. And I'll say it's not particularly helpful for everybody, but it had just got to the point where it was too painful to try. And it was humbling to admit that I can't do this. Every time I try to intentionally pursue weight loss, my eating gets out of control. Like even now, there'll be times when I'll be like, you could just test it. And then straight away it starts to wobble. And I'm like, no, okay, let me come back. Let me recenter. I can't go back here. That's a really difficult thing to admit in a world where you're supposed to be pursuing this thing and where some people seem to be managing to do it.
Oh, and everybody appears like they've got it together and that they're surely doing it. And then you feel like, what am I failing at? How come this is not easy for me? How come this looks very effortless for everybody else to live this way? And I am going home exhausted by the mental and physical gymnastics that I have to do to maintain or try to accomplish getting to a body that at the end of the day, the real puzzle piece coming in is that like you're fighting physiology in some way. You're fighting against something that you absolutely just need to leave alone.
I've just got that button in my brain. There's that little switch, that trigger, that if I try to engage in these things, it goes. And I think that might be similar for other eating disorders in different ways, having their own certain triggers, certain ways that people will sometimes say to me, does this mean I'm going to struggle with this for the rest of my life? You know, do you ever fully recover from an eating disorder? I think that's a question that a lot of people want to know the answer to. I think always start from a place of yes, that full recovery is possible. But it may mean, and I think for a lot of people, that there's just a certain level of vigilance that has to be there, which is not the same as fighting with your eating disorder every day, because people are like, well, if it's not going to disappear, why do the work? It gets so much better. It just means that it's not consuming your days anymore. But it does mean you have to be a bit vigilant sometimes for certain people. I don't want to, yeah.
I mean, it's almost as if having been through it, your antenna just is a little bit more sensitive to those blips in frequency. And they just always will be a little bit more attuned to that kind of talk, that kind of mentality. The key is that if it's very in tune, that you can catch it right away should anything kind of come up. And I mean, I think it's incredible that you've done so much of this through self-awareness, that like you really came from within to pursue getting well and being well a lot on your own. And despite meeting these hurdles, like the system kind of preventing you from having the recognition in order to get that help, I'd like to kind of take a step back and talk about sort of like the basics, because I think that, as you alluded to, there are a lot of myths and there's a lot of shame and misunderstanding about what binge eating and binge eating disorder are. And so I'd like to get kind of how you view and what your definitions are of what is binge eating, what is binge eating disorder, and then how does that differ from something like overeating? Because I hear from a lot of people and I hear from friends that I feel like I can't stop eating, and then I just like feel so garbage when I go to bed, and I really need to stop this, quote unquote. I really need to stop doing this. I really need to get control of that part. And so I want to hear your thoughts on what the differences between those things are.
So if we're looking at a sort of a diagnostic framework, a binge is eating within a discrete period of time, normally less than 2 hours, an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in similar circumstances, and that the person has a subjective sense that they've lost control of what they're eating or how much they're eating. So even in the diagnostic criteria, there's a huge amount of subjectivity. I mean, what's everybody else eating? What's everyone else eating?
That seems pretty gray and woolly to me, to be like, well, most people sort of do this within this time period, but you don't. Like, what?
Yes, exactly. And so you might say, well, if somebody doesn't eat anything all day and then binges in the evening, you could probably say that a lot of people would binge and eat a lot of food in the evening after that. Or another one is going on a holiday, an all-inclusive holiday. People are much more likely to eat a lot more than they would normally. Technically, that doesn't come under a binge. So there's all kinds of problems in the first bit in actually defining what a binge is, because there's no guidance as to what that actual quantity of food will be. And then there's other kind of more like what they call the impairment criteria, so the impact that it's having. So if it's causing a lot of guilt and shame, if you're eating in secret, if you are embarrassed about what you're eating, if you're eating a lot when you're not hungry, if you eat more rapidly than normal. There's a list of some of those, and you've just got to meet 3 out of 5 of them. So you don't have to have all of them, but you need to have a few of these. Another thing is around frequency. So for binge eating disorder, it's got to be at least an average of once a week for 3 months. And then the final part, actually second to final part, is that there has to be marked distress, that the eating is present. A lot of people want to diagnose people in their lives with binge eating disorder.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you're binging and you're cool about it and you're like, this is just who I am and I don't care, it can't be an eating disorder. And then the last bit is just that it's not accompanied by compensatory behaviors, which is, the laxatives, purging, over-exercising.
Right. And I wonder then if that sort of prevents people from getting help if they're like, well, I don't meet all of these criteria, but they're having distress in the way that their relationship with food is. And to me, the differentiation is that subjective lack of control, that real like overtaking of I could not stop if I wanted to, which to me feels like it's very different than just overeating because you went back for seconds, you went back for thirds, and you ate until you were stuffed, and now you're like, oh, I don't feel good. But you felt in control. Even if it was mindless, it wasn't this like compelled, something's taken over my body and I can't stop. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's the most frightening part, I think, for most people, that out of control and that compulsion, because compulsion feels like you're acting against your own will. You know, people talk about feeling numb or disassociated or like not really connected to the experience. You're not even, once you're in the full-blown binge mode, it's like you're not even registering that you're filling up with food. And quite often it's not till all the food's gone and the trance is broken, now you feel uncomfortably stuffed. You were completely shut off from that during the experience. That, I think, is how intense binging can feel compared to, like you say, that overeating experience where it's a bit of like a, oh, but this food tastes so good, and you know, I'm telling myself I probably shouldn't, but I really am tempted by it, so I really want this food. It's more about the food, whereas binging feels like it's more about something else. It feels like this bigger monster that you're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then how can people who are dealing with some spectrum of that deal with it? Because with overeating, the sort of mentality of, oh, I just like really need to get a handle on this. Where does this all come from? Does it all stem from restriction and the mental restriction as well as the physical?
I think we have to address the restriction first to see if there's anything else underneath it. Because if we don't address the restriction first, we don't know whether a binge was driven by something emotional, by something biological, by trauma, by all kinds of things, by even certain reactions to certain kinds of foods as well. I'm an all foods fits practitioner, but we have to be honest when we're talking about certain foods are more satiating than others. Certain foods, I tend to talk about foods as having, some foods just have rusty breaks. So it's harder for your brain to go, okay, we've had enough.
Ah, okay. And are those foods different for everybody, or are there foods that are just simply more common to be rusty breaks foods?
I mean, people can binge on anything really, but on the whole, it tends to be the foods that are higher in sort of sugar and salt. And putting sugar and fat together is a very enticing combination because nature doesn't do that very often, doesn't bring those two things together. The only place that actually where nature puts sugar and fat together, any idea where that is?
No, milk.
Yeah, breast milk.
Is it milk? Oh, okay.
Breast milk, especially.
Yeah,
the fat to sugar combination. So of course, you know, the psychoanalysts have a field day with this about one of the reasons why we might be drawn to these foods and the love and connection side of it, which really does make sense to some people when they hear that resonates and they feel like that is their experience.
Right. Okay. So it's so the origins of binge eating can be all of these different biological, psychosocial factors. The mentality of restriction seems to be why we stay stuck in it for so long. And do you think there's also something to be said for the stigma around weight and restriction and binging that prevents people from being able to get help?
Absolutely. And also, it's not just that they're likely to be dismissed if they try and get help. A lot of the time they're dismissing their own problem because they've got all the judgments that society has, because we've all been exposed to many of the similar messages out there. So first of all, for someone to take their own problem seriously has to happen first. And the amount of times I get messages from people and they'll tell me they've just heard about this binge eating and they had no idea it was a thing and they can't believe it because that's exactly them. And they have no idea that other people are experiencing something similar, or that it is a concept, that it's something we know something about and you're not the only one who struggles with it. And there are things that we can do and ways that we can work with it. It's not an easy problem to have because it's so complex. We're talking about biology and psychology and emotions and socializing and spirituality, if that's your thing as well. Like it just affects all areas of our life. Food does.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you're now working with clients in overcoming binge eating and binge eating disorder. How many do you think are sort of clinically binge eating disorder diagnosed or diagnosable? And how many are, you know, people that maybe don't meet the criteria, but are overeating and just looking to heal their relationship with food? And then how does your approach in treating those things and working through them, how does it differ?
So I don't use the word treating. because I can't treat anyone.
Ooh, good. I will think about the use of that word. Yes. Okay. Very important.
It's this idea you're going to someone and that person's going to fix you, I think is quite a problematic place to go. I couldn't care less whether someone calls it an eating disorder or not, or whether they fit the criteria. I'm much more interested in somebody's experience. And one of the first questions I always ask someone when I meet them is I'll say, I'm just going to ask you a very simple question. I just want to know the first thing that pops into your head. And I'll simply say, why do you think you struggle with food? What's the first thing that pops into your head? Sometimes people are really surprised at what their brain throws up. Sometimes it's just not what they were expecting. And it's not about whether it's right or wrong, but we have to start with what is it people are believing about their problem, and how is that very belief system holding that problem up, supporting that problem. So there's an enormous amount of shame. And I mean, I love Brené Brown. Who doesn't? But she's got a lovely quote about shame. She's got many, but one of them that I particularly like is the one where she says something about shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we're capable of change.
Oh, yeah.
So this is why I think the CBT treatment outcomes for binge eating are really poor. Compared to something like anxiety or depression, the outcomes are really poor. And I think it's because people are not moving out of shame. They're going to a practitioner who's taking a very behavioral approach. Eat these 3 meals a day and these 2 snacks. And don't get me wrong, eating regularly is really important in binge eating recovery, but they're so focused on the behavior. And then when the person is struggling to adhere to the behavior, the shame's being perpetuated over and over again.
They think that something's wrong with them. And that's basically their own confirmation bias coming into play, saying, oh, I thought that it was just a me problem. And now that I can't adhere to this regimen of behaviors, I'm proving to myself that I am just not disciplined enough to fix this myself.
Exactly that. So I love running groups. So I run 4 weekly therapy groups for binge eating. And I see some individual ones, but there's something about the group. There's something that happens in the group that's really difficult to replicate in one-to-one therapy. When people are hearing each other and it comes up again and again, people will say to one another, it's like you're in my head. And the antidote to shame, I think, is connection and compassion. Well, the group provides the connection part of it, a sense of belonging, a place where you can actually say what's really true for you, where you feel like you can't say it anywhere else because no one else will understand, or maybe they'll judge. And the compassion part, it is so much easier to have compassion for someone else who's going through something, even if it's the same thing you're going through, than it is for you to find that same compassion for yourself. So you start by finding it for others, by being in other people's stories, feeling the compassion for them, and the group starts to act as a bit of a mirror for each other. And they call each other out when they're being critical, when people are being self-critical in the group, because we do it in subtle ways with our language. All the time, someone will say, oh, I know it's ridiculous, but da, 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 da. And people will go, hang on, you just called yourself ridiculous 3 times.
Yeah, like I've experienced that in groups too. And I completely agree. I've been in groups and someone said, oh, well, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And it's like, well, stop shoulding all over yourself. And someone, or, this really gentle sort of like, well, I noticed that you're using that judgmental language with yourself, depending on how clinical the group is, which I have thoughts about. But to me, the conversations that come from that, and even coming from this, and the reason that I'm recording these and putting them out there, is that just hearing that somebody else has that same thought that you do, that one that you don't tell anybody about because you're like, this would sound insane, and I feel really shameful about even thinking these things, even about myself, because I don't want other people to think that I think about them this way, or that I think about their bodies this way, but I think them about me. And being able to share that and hear that reflected back by someone else saying, me too, I feel like that's really the place that we can lift the lid off of the shame and then actually start to take steps forward, because you're feeling less isolated.
Mm-hmm. The more distressed and frustrated we are about any problem we have, the more we can't find mental clarity or perspective around it. It's almost like we have to reduce the distress first before we can make some behavioral changes. But I'll often say people try to stop binge eating by trying to stop binge eating. Like, that's the method.
Yeah. Just recover from your eating disorder by stopping the behaviors. And so much quote unquote treatment, so many approaches are focused on solely the behavior. And I think that in my experience, everything that's sort of fallen into place when things have really clicked, which has been quite recent for me, is that it's been this buildup of what are the underlying emotional factors going on. Then you sort of see that the eating disorder makes less and less and less sense, but the behaviors are then less difficult to change, is at least what I find for myself, where it feels more difficult to change a behavior brute force and then hope that the emotional and mental part comes along with it, then doing that in tandem and processing those things as we go along, then the behaviors just seem to make less sense. And you almost eliminate the clutter of your brain and can see, like, wait, why am I doing this?
I couldn't agree more.
And so you have a method that you write about in your book, and your book is called I Can't Stop Eating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called the Rallick method. Could you say a little bit about what that method is and how you approach it?
The whole point of the method is to try and move yourself out of compulsion and into free choice. So the problem is when people hear about a method or a technique of some kind, they're like, great, is this going to make me stop binging? And the minute you think you know what the decision should be at the end of going through the steps, you've already taken that choice away from yourself. So you can't go through the steps. So it's really before you even approach the method, to find that intention, you want to move out of compulsion so that it's actually a choice. And for it to be a choice, but all options have to be on the table. Because if you're saying I've got to do this so I don't binge, you've removed your choice straight away. And what I often talk about with binge eating is it's a conflict. It's an inner conflict because part of you wants to do this and part of you doesn't. So you're in a fight with yourself. And no matter which side wins, part of you has to lose. But the thing is, the binge normally wins because in theory, once you start that conflict, if you're having that back and forth with yourself about whether to binge or not, it feels like it could go on forever until you binge. So a lot of the time it's like, just binge.
It's just easier to give in.
Yeah. Well, it's because it really does feel like this isn't going to go anywhere in the moment. It feels like this is going to go on forever. It's not rational, but that's often how it feels. So the Rallick is 4 steps. And the first part is the R, which is the recognize. And this is about grounding yourself in the moment with what is actually going on right here, right now. So there's 3 parts to our reality in the moment. There is the objective circumstances. So whether it's raining, what time it is, where you are, all these things that if 100 people look at those circumstances, they're all going to agree that's what's happening. You've got your thoughts, what you're believing, and you've got what you're feeling. And we bring these 3 things together and we form a story out of it. And that is our reality. So with the recognition part, we break that down. So we start off with the objective circumstances. So these are, I call them recognition statements. So I suggest to people when they're doing this, they either write them down or they speak them out loud. So if you were going to do it after a binge, it would be, I recognize I am sitting in my bedroom. I recognize it's 9 p.m. And then you might say, I recognize I have just eaten, and then reel off what you've actually eaten. Don't say I recognize I binge, because as we already know, binging is a subjective term. Mm-hmm. So it has to be the pure facts of the matter. Then you go to your feeling. So it's I recognize I am feeling. And if you notice in these statements, there's 2 I. There's the I who's the recognizer and the I who's having the experience. And this is what we want to do, because as human beings, we have the capacity to watch ourselves think and self-observe. As far as we know, other animals out there don't do this. So it would be, I recognize I am feeling. Say the statement or write the statement even before you even know how it's going to end. So I recognize I am feeling disgust, might be 1. And then you do it again. And I normally tell people to do 2 or 3, but if we just go with disgust and despair for now, because those I think are very common emotions after a binge, then it would go to what you're believing. So I recognize I am believing. It's in the continuous present, not I believe as if it's this absolute statement. I am believing, because even beliefs are an experience in the moment and our beliefs change. So I recognize I am believing. I've failed again. I recognize I am believing. I'm never going to be able to solve this problem. And then I sometimes suggest people do, and I recognize I'm telling myself that I'm a useless waste of space. whatever it might be. So a few statements with them. So that has taken a snapshot of this moment, this reality now. That's what's happening. So then you move into the acceptance part. And so we go through and we look at these statements. We're like, can I accept these things? So when we start with the objective circumstance, can I accept I'm sitting in my room? That one's normally fairly easy. Can I accept it's 9 p.m.? Probably, yeah. Can I accept I've eaten X, Y, Z? Okay, you wait till you feel a bit of resistance there. You're like, okay, what would be the advantage for someone, do you think, Maddie, of accepting what they've eaten? How is that an advantage?
Well, there's nothing about it that they can change. So then there's actually a chance that they can mentally move past it if they've accepted it as almost a part of that objective reality. There's nothing that I can do about this, so I might as well accept it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what I get people to do is to ask themselves that question, like, what would be the benefit of me accepting this? Because actually it's exactly that, it's already happened. Because it's more painful to fight against something. You know, do you want to get in a fight with reality? You can, but you're never going to win that one, are you?
That's going to be a tough battle for you. That's going to be fruitless. Yeah.
Exactly. So you do that with the circumstances, and then you move to the feeling. So why would somebody accept they were feeling despair?
Because it's such a natural consequence of something that you feel shame about. If you feel shame, you might feel very hopeless about that.
Yeah.
So that's very normal feeling, maybe normalizing that you would look to someone else and say, I could understand how that person would feel despair in that moment, and kind of apply that to yourself.
Yeah, lovely. I like that. Also, one's like, sometimes when I'll do it, because I'll use this in other things, situations in my life, sometimes I've got a feeling I don't like. It'll just be, I can accept, because I'm already feeling it. I can accept it because it's already here. So whether I accept it or not, I'm still going to feel it. And actually, by not accepting our feelings, by judging our feeling, that's what usually makes them worse. Another one is if I accept it, it's likely to pass sooner. That's true as well. So you find these reasons, and this is not, you can't make yourself feel the acceptance, but you can cognitively get your mind on board. And that's what the acceptance part is. You go through each bit and you're like, why would I accept this? Can I find reasons to accept this? And it's the same with thoughts. It would be, sometimes with a thought, one of mine is just like, well, of course I'm thinking this thought in this situation. This is what I always think in this situation. Like, this is my pattern.
Right on schedule. That's the thought. I can accept it because I recognize it.
Yeah. And sometimes I can accept it because it's an experience. It doesn't mean it's true. That takes a lot of power out of the thoughts. So yeah, you go through each thing one by one and do the acceptance part. And then the next bit, which is the lean in, whatever you're left with at this point, maybe you're still feeling all the same stuff and it hasn't reduced, maybe it has reduced, but whatever your experience is in that moment, whatever your emotional experiences you're left with, you just, because you've accepted these things, you move towards them.
Oh.
So it's not, I can't bear the phrase sitting with your feelings, because it sounds so passive. It sounds like you just sit there feeling.
Yeah.
This is more of like actually moving into the experience. It's a welcoming and an embracing of this experience. What you do when you say to yourself, I'm willing to experience this moment in reality, is now that compulsive urge to escape the moment reduces. Because compulsion is about escape. This is intolerable, this feeling. I have to get away. I have to get away from myself. I have to get away from this feeling. I have to not think. I have to not feel. All of those things are part of compulsion.
That is so interesting. And I agree that the resonance of the phrase sit with your feelings has, for me, this mental image of like sitting there and just being like feeling and bad feeling, and then just like sit there and wait for it to go. And this idea of running towards the feeling, or at the very least welcoming them in. When I was going through a breakup previously earlier in the year, and in the period where I was having a lot of emotions come up about it, like anger and hurt and like just distress. And I would go, and the tape that I managed to record and play for myself then after that was, come in, little feelings, you are all welcome here. And it was as if I was opening this little door and just sort of letting them in. And there was something about that switch for me. Like I could cry talking about it, because it's like, come in, like, it's okay. Come in here. You're safe here. You're welcome here. I will feel you. So that's been my version, I guess, of not having the same vocabulary of saying lean in, but sort of like this welcome in.
And it's a really powerful thing to do that, because you're taking, I don't really like the word control, is a bit problematic around eating disorders, but there's something about you making that decision to feel this, to go, yes, because it's already happening. This is my reality. All these things, the circumstances, what I'm believing, what I'm feeling, is all just happening right now. It's here. And I think we think by trying to push it away that somehow we make it not real, but it just comes back with more force and in other ways as well. And then I think, especially when we try and push things outside of our awareness, I think it's the stuff that we push to the back of our mind that we're not aware of that trips us up the most with our behavior. We see it in little kids all the time. They'll act out in these ways, and they're acting out at school, and they have no idea why they're behaving that way at school, down to kids not knowing when they're hungry and tired and acting out. Like, if we don't know what it is, I think we do act out as adults in ways that we don't understand, and when we're confused by our behavior, and exacerbates everything. But that then just takes us on to the last bit, which is the C, and that's where you just make your choice. And sometimes there is nothing to choose. Like after a binge, quite often by the time you got to that point, you've done the work. The choice might be, I don't know, setting an intention going forward, something that supports you. So sometimes people might take one of the intuitive eating principles to focus on. So it might be something like, okay, I have permission to eat whatever I want from this moment onwards. I'm just going to focus on trying to feel satisfied, for example. That, I think, is a really helpful intention. I can eat whatever I want. The only condition I'm going to put on that is that I really try to enjoy my food. All these things that are incompatible with binge eating, but not about don't binge, don't binge, don't binge. Because people, when they focus on the thing they don't want, we cause more of it. We just keep fighting with this thing we don't want, rather than what is it we're trying to create over here that's not compatible with that thing we don't want over there.
Yeah. Don't press the button. Don't think about white elephants. Like,
yeah. Exactly that.
Okay, so that's the Rallick method, and that's incredible. That's really powerful. I feel like we all just got a whole therapy session of just that method. So I will always ask people towards the end of the interview what was in their own journey the least helpful, either, comment, statement, or advice when you were going through your eating disorder.
Well, there was one thing that did torture me for many years. I mentioned it in my book. When it all began, I was in a relationship at that time. And in that relationship, when my binge eating began, because it was so out of character for me, I didn't understand what was going on. And I remember eventually telling him, and he said to me, he said to me, I even feel it now. He said, I thought you were stronger than that. So for me, this idea about feeling like it was a weakness, and I think it affected me so much because it was exactly how I was feeling as well. It really hooked into something that I was struggling with, I was grappling with. And so for someone else to say it kind of made it feel really true. So I've had to own my own reaction to that, because I believed that too at that time. So I can't blame him for saying it and believing it, because I believed it too. But the problem was with him saying it is it reaffirmed and rooted down and cemented that belief that this was some kind of weakness.
That you already had that story for yourself. Mm-hmm. And then what was the most helpful, or what would you say to somebody who wanted to help somebody else with this? What helped you the most?
I don't know that it was a thing that someone particularly said, but I think one of the most transformative teachers in my life was Byron Katie's work. Do you know Byron Katie?
I don't.
Well, her whole thing is about challenging your beliefs. You can work through this. And you basically take these beliefs and you do these turnarounds and you look at the opposites and you switch around the characters and all these things, which for me really helped me to, I don't want to say undo, because I still have vulnerabilities for it, but it really did reduce my black and white, all or nothing thinking, which was crucial to have been able to do that, to be able to move through the recovery process. So whilst it wasn't specific to food, her teachings, and she puts a lot of stuff out there for free. It's really, and I've seen her live, and even like her ticket prices for her events are really reasonable. I feel like she's quite ethical in her business as well. So I've got a lot of respect for that lady.
Oh, that's brilliant. So I'll definitely share links out of her material. I will share all of the information about your book and your resources. What is the best way for people to find you, Sarah?
Oh, I put myself all over the place, Maddie. So on Instagram and YouTube, I'm the binge eating therapist. I've also got a podcast that I co-host called Life After Diets. And my website is thebingeeatingtherapist.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing so openly, not just your own story and how you came to be now doing this life-changing work for and with other people, mostly with other people, because we can't treat them, but we can be there to support them along the way. I can't thank you enough for being here. I know that this episode is going to help a lot of people.
Thank you, Maddie. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for having me.